Hey everybody, it is good to connect with you yet again. Ambassador to the US from South Africa, Ebrahim Rasool, was declared persona non grata, effectively being asked to leave the US within 72 hours and return back home. This has been a significant development in bilateral relations between us and the US. Ebrahim Rasool, a person I have met, I have plenty of time for Ebrahim Rasool. I've had engagements with him, and I've always found him interesting. I've always found him intelligent. And yet, in this particular instant, I found his comments fascinating. So, for exactness' sake, I want to say, what did he say?
That I think what Donald Trump is launching is an assault on incumbency, those who are in power, by mobilizing a supremacism against the incumbency at home, and I think I've illustrated abroad as well. So in terms of that, the supremacist assault on incumbency, we see it in the domestic politics of the USA, the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, as a response, not simply to a supremacist instinct, but to very clear data that shows great demographic shifts in the USA, in which the voting electorate in the USA is projected to become 48% white, and that the possibility of a majority of minorities is looming on the horizon. And so that needs to be factored in so that we understand some of the things that we think are instinctive, nativist, racist things. I think that there's data that, for example, would support that would go to this wall being built, the deportation movement, etc., etc. So I think I mentioned that. I think that there is also an export of the revolution. It's no accident that that Elon Musk has involved himself in UK politics and elevated a Nigel Farage and the reform movement in much the same way that it was instructive that on his way to the Munich Security Summit, Vice President Vance addressed the Alternative für Deutschland to strengthen them in their election campaign. And that then begins to say, what was the role then of Afrikaners in that whole makeup? And very clearly, it's to project white victimhood as a dog whistle, that there is a global protective movement that is beginning to envelop embattled white communities, or apparently embattled white communities. It may not be true, it may not make sense, but that is not the dog whistle that is being heard in a global white base. So I think we need to understand all of that.
Those are the comments. What do they mean? I had to ask myself the honest question, which was, whether you agree or disagree with the comments, on whose behalf were these comments made? Because when you are a diplomat, effectively, you speak on behalf of all South Africans. You are an embassy representing the Republic of South Africa. Not a political party, not your personal views, not any other thing except that. So this was then the organizing question with which we've got to think through this issue. Because we train our ambassadors to go and represent us. They go and represent us on various missions. And therefore, I felt in this instance, these comments were not reflective of the broader South African public, were narrow in and of themselves, and ultimately were received as such by the US, but have had profound consequences on how we, the people of South Africa, consume or at least are being treated by the US. Let me be clear. The US-South Africa relations have been under profound stress in the recent while. The election of President Trump has come through it with a number of executive orders, notwithstanding the invitation, as I watched the other day, of many Afrikaners to go relocate to the US, which I've heard as I was watching a report the other day, that about 70,000 people have done inquiry about information about how they could exercise this through the Chamber of Commerce or one of the chambers of commerce. But it has also meant that there's been a removal of funding around PEPFAR. Now, PEPFAR is a fund that was established, I think, under President Bush in partnership with South Africa to be able to intervene at the height of the HIV pandemic. It was designed to deal with the SADC region and be able to ensure that a virus, that we could be able to contain the virus, provide ARVs, and ensure that we don't see a generation of people be killed by HIV/AIDS. So this is one of the issues that, as President Trump has come into office, as some of the executive orders. It's also the halting of US aid globally. And this is intervention that the US has been able to do, particularly in African countries that simply, in some ways, are incapable of dealing with some of their health budgets. These are some of the issues that US aid were helping with. So, if you had that context, you have a view on President Trump. How do we ensure that at one level, as many South Africans have said, we can't simply just allow President Trump to bully South Africa? At another level, there's another conversation about the fact that actually our economy and our healthcare budget is dependent on the US in certain instances for 100,000 jobs. Which choice do you make? This is the actual job of political leadership and foreign policy. It isn't making a choice between good versus bad. It is making a choice between worse or much worse. And if you frame the conversation in that way, then which is the worst choice and which is the much worse choice? Which remarks do you make and which ones don't you? I must say, I saw the president the other day speaks about whether or not we're being blue-ticked or not being blue-ticked on this issue. We must be wary of that because actually our relations with the US are 100,000 job price tag that comes with it, notwithstanding the health budget and many other issues. So let me speak about the 100,000 jobs. This speaks to our partnership on AGOA. What is AGOA? For many people who don't know, it's our partnership with the US where some of the goods that we export to the US get preferential rates. This allows us to be able to be a net exporter to the US and allow more of our goods to be consumed, which ultimately means more people can find jobs. It does, with and of itself, mean that, for example, the number of goods that have taken in exports from the US to South Africa in 2022 was 6.5 billion or 130 billion rand. So we need the nature of goods coming in, and the value of imports from South Africa to the US was about 14.6 billion rands, which is about 280 billion rand. So in essence, what you can see is that our trade balance is much more favorable on our favor as we are able to export more goods to the US. Furthermore, is that the legislation has been in place. It's not just a one-way stream. It's also a relationship that we hold between us and the US. There are many goods that they need from South Africa in the same way as there are goods that the US is able to bring to South Africa that we need. And the conditions in the AGOA legislation are as follows. In order to qualify and to remain eligible for AGOA, an AGOA beneficiary country must demonstrate respect for the rule of law, for human rights, and core labor standards. It's an important provision is to be aware that the beneficiary country should also not seek to undermine US foreign policy interests. Thirdly, AGOA includes a statutory requirement for annual reviews to examine the compliance of each participating country. So now we are very cognizant of those provisions in law. And frankly, the Biden administration was compelled by law to be able to do the same exercise, as is the Trump administration being able to do the same as things stand now. So what does, in fact, mean for us as a position, and why as South Africa we've had to now really grapple with this question whether have we in any way undermined the US foreign policy interests? And there are others who might argue the case that we've used many multiple avenues to demonstrate us in some ways being treated like a state that is anti the US. And this was symbolic not only of the comments that Mr. Rasool has made, but some of the hosts. We saw the former minister, the foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, hosting a delegation from Iran, which is clearly a state that is antagonistic to the US, at least from their perspective. We saw South African Defense Minister Thandi Modise go to Moscow in a space where we've always said we are non-aligned on the issue of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and yet we were able to take a side in being able to, in some ways, be perceived to be a country that is siding with Russia. And a lesson to learn here is that, a bit like India have certainly understood the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and made their position non-aligned. It's the difficulties that go with which position do you take if you're a non-aligned party or two-state solution party on the Middle Eastern conflict. So these are items that when people review whether are you an ally of the US or not, really do come into consideration in many ways. And then now the more recent one is the renaming of Santon Drive in the way that process has been taking place, to mean that, as Nomvula Mokonyane has already said, that they want for the embassy of the US to change its letterhead to be on Leila Khalid Drive. So these conversations demonstrate to the United States that maybe we are not necessarily a friendly nation towards them, and that relationship needs resetting. But with all of that, I don't think all of it is lost. I think actually we can find a balance between going, we have to restore the sovereignty of South Africa. And on the first instance, I would think, particularly on the PEPFAR funding, that we need to create an Africa fund. We need to create a fund that does two things: enhances pharmacology, where we can build our own pharmaceutical capacity so that we can make our own vaccines. But furthermore, South Africa has already demonstrated capability on patents to be able to deal with that. That's important. But we need to create a fund because HIV and AIDS is not a virus that can only be located in South Africa. You've also seen in some of the SADC countries the proliferation of that, and therefore in the shared burden of which hospital care you provide, the provision of ARVs, I think a partnership fund must be able to do that. So part of us creating sovereignty is about us being able to pay for our own health bill, and that is something that Africa needs to be able to do. Second, along with that, is that we need to narrow relations between us and the US bilaterally on trade. And this is going to be important to determine who the next ambassador to the US is, because that person needs to be able to go through there, ensure that AGOA in its review, we're a country that does uphold human rights, despite that sometimes I think we could do more in the SADC region. But within the country, I can have a view, you can have a view, actually anyone can have a view. Your rights are protected, we uphold the rule of law, and ultimately, we've got to be able to demonstrate that relative to other parts of the world, I think South Africa is a very strong democratic nation. So whoever the ambassador is must narrowly have a conversation about trade and how we can ensure more goods between the two countries come together. And this is where I agree in some ways with President Ramaphosa. There needs to be a call that says, can we do a deal about trade? But the third thing is we need a delegation to go to Washington. I don't think it's wise to simply say, well, we're not going to talk to them. It would feel in this country that anyone who wants to go to the US is able to do so. On whose behalf is AfriForum speaking other than a narrow partisan interest? On whose behalf is the DA speaking other than their narrow political interests? But both of those delegations have been to the US to somewhat meet. How is it that we as a South African government or South African government has not been able to put a delegation before that? I think it's important enough that we engage, reset relations, build them, particularly in a year that South Africa is chairing the BRICS Summit. These are vital moments. And like I said to you earlier, yes, this choice may not feel like one side is going to win, or we can browbeat or chest or beat out or say to ourselves we've won on this issue. The reality is we are in a situation where we've got to make choices that are in the best interest of South Africans. And for me, that choice is about preserving the 100,000 jobs. That choice is about making sure that our trades, our relations with the US are not political in that sense, but are focused on trade, and ultimately being able to strengthen our relations in Africa. That's got to be the focus, because ultimately my primary interest is about making sure the people of this country can have an economy that grows, that is able to create more jobs. And the US as a third trading partner, the third highest trading partner, is not one that we can easily ignore. So this is a moment for us to think about the difficulties of foreign policy and the difficulties of what we've got to do. But I sincerely hope the next ambassador is conscious of those interests, will advance the interests of all South Africans, and we can ensure that we build an economy that works for all the people. I hope that is helpful to you. I'll speak to you soon. Sha.